Hello, I'm Helen McEwen and I'm going to be presenting the first section on this Preparing for Postgraduate Study course. This is going to be focused on what psychology is and looking at psychology as a science. First of all, I'm going to give you an overview of this section content. So we'll first be starting with the lecture 1, which is the one that this one is. There'll then be a quiz on the content of lecture 1, and this includes the videos which are incorporated in this lecture. There'll be a second lecture with an activity following this, and then a second quiz at the end of the section focused on the activity content. Finally, there'll be another lecture, lecture 3, and then you'll be able to move on to the next section, which is looking at research methods in psychology. Okay, so focusing back to this specific lecture content, lecture 1 will give you an introduction to the discipline of psychology, its history, and then we'll look at psychology as a scientific discipline. Firstly, the discipline of psychology. So psychology is the scientific study of people, the mind, and behaviour, and this is what the British Psychological Society, the BPS, recognise it to be. This is further broken down to the mind being an inner experience, perception, thoughts, feelings and memories, and the behaviour being observable actions. So mind is seen as internal and behaviour is seen as external. Across psychology, there are a variety of different domains of inquiry, and these are just a few of them. For example, you could look at forensic psychology as a discipline, and you could look at health psychology as a discipline. You could also look at evolution, for example. These main domains are biological, cognitive, developmental, social and individual differences. So cognitive, for example, could be looking at the way in which people process information, the way in which they think and remember information. Developmental, as it sounds, a way in which people develop. Social could be the way in which people interact. And individual difference can be different variables and the way in which people differ from one another. And these are just a few examples of the way in which this could be broken down. So as I say, you could look at things like memory, sleep, bystander effects, personality, eating behaviours, endocrines, reasoning, pain, moral development, for example, and you can look back through these and go through them in more detail if you wish, or in sessions that you may be taught in your course. Okay, so moving on to the history of psychology. Why is it important to study the history of psychology? Well, it's argued that only by exploring psychology's origins and studying its development can we see clearly the nature of psychology today. So we need to look at the past in order to look at how it's developed and what psychology is now. And there are philosophical roots which underpin this. Firstly, there are the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. And Plato argued the concept of nativism, so certain kinds of knowledge are innate or inborn. We're born with particular knowledge. Whereas Aristotle says that all knowledge is acquired through experience, and this is empiricism. So one is arguing that you're born with information and knowledge, and the other is arguing that you develop this over time. Descartes argued that the brain and mind were different, and the body is material whilst the mind is immaterial or spiritual. However, this has been rejected and it's been argued that the mind is what the brain does. And most scientists argue against the notion of dualism. So it's argued that the brain and mind are whole as opposed to being different, which is Descartes' original viewpoint. Moving on from this, there's been the concept of phrenology. And as you can see in this diagram, it is thought that mental abilities and characteristics are localised in specific brain regions. So, for example, there are different characteristics and mental abilities which are split into domestic, aspiring, animal, moral, self-perfecting, perceptives and reflectives. And it was viewed that bumps and indentations on the skull reflect size of brain regions and attributes. However, this has been based on anecdotes and casual observations, and there's no evidence to support this. So this is an early thoughts and ideas, and it's not particularly accepted in modern day psychology. So moving on to the birth of psychology. William Wundt opened the first laboratory dedicated to psychological study, and that was in 1867 that was first developed. Structuralism is an early notion, and Wundt was interested in the study of consciousness through the principle of structuralism. So this is analysis of the basic elements, the structure of something. And to do this, he used the method of introspection, which is subjective observation of your own experience. In contrast, William James argued that breaking down consciousness into its components, so it's structuralism that Wundt is talking about, distorts its nature, and he proposed that there's functionalism, which is the study of the purpose mental processes serve in enabling people to adapt to their environment. So structuralism is looking at the component parts, whereas functionalism is looking at the purpose of processes and what they enable people to do in terms to adapt to their environment. There's a YouTube clip at the bottom here that you may wish to look at, which breaks this down and looks at the comparisons in more detail. Gestalt psychology was another area in psychology, and this was arguing that we perceive the whole rather than the sum of the parts. So for example, you could look at the bottom right diagram and see it as a smiley face, as opposed to seeing it as a combination of dots and dashes making the face and the square around it. A key player that you may think of when you psychology jumps to mind is Sigmund Freud. He suggested that patient problems result from underlying unconscious conflict, and this is managed through defence mechanisms such as denial. And mental health problems arise as a result of ego anxieties or defence mechanisms. So the key point is that people have this happening unconsciously. They're not aware of what's going on. Maslow and Rogers argued that you should look at positive potential of human beings, and that is an approach to understanding human nature that emphasises this. And from this notion developed client-centred therapy, looking at empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard. So it's a different form of therapy, developing on from the darkness which you could be attributed to Freud's theory to the light in humanistic psychology. The behaviourist approach developed later on, and behavioural psychology is the study of external behaviour, and it's argued that behaviour is objective and observable. So as opposed to internal behaviours that are going on inside your head, which you can't observe necessarily, then behavioural psychology is saying that you can look at objective and observable events, so what a person is doing can be observed. Behaviourists claimed introspection is liable to interpretation error, since what happens in an individual's mind can never truly be known. Watson believed that human behaviour is influenced by the environment, and this is an empiricist viewpoint. So you can look at what a person's doing, and that's influenced by an environment. So it may be, for example, a person behaves differently in a different scenario. So in modern day, most of psychology is attributed and regulated by the British Psychological Society, the BPS. It's very useful to familiarise yourself with the BPS websites to look at the way in which psychology functions in modern day. The BPS aims to promote excellent and ethical practice in the science, education and practical applications of psychology. And they do that through supporting members' careers and professional development, providing information to the public, increasing awareness, raising standards, organising conference events, etc. So it could be that the BPS helps with your development as a psychologist through accrediting a course to show that it meets the requirements in order to become a graduate member of the BPS. For example, it could be accrediting an undergraduate degree or a master's degree in order to give you the possibility of getting graduate basis registration and then do further study to become a clinical psychologist, for example. So I'm now going to play you a summary video which will give you an overview of the different areas of psychology and the way in which it has developed as a discipline over time. So I'm just going to skip to a bit further on in this video for you, and we will start it here.
When hearing the word psychology, most people probably think of a therapist listening to a patient unpacking the details of his day while reclining on a couch. Maybe that therapist is wearing glasses, chewing on a cigar, stroking his whiskered chin. Admit it, if you're thinking about psychology, you're probably picturing Freud. Sigmund Freud was one of the most tremendously influential and controversial thinkers of his time, maybe of all time. His theories helped build our views on childhood, personality, dreams, and sexuality, and his work fueled a legacy of both support and opposition. His life was long and spanned an important swath of history from the American Civil War to World War II. But like most great scientists, Freud developed his revolutionary ideas by building on the work of others. And of course, innovation in the field didn't stop with him. In truth, psychology is one of the most wildly diverse sciences in terms of the questions it proposes, the methods it applies, and the different schools of thought and disciplines it contains. Perhaps more than any other science, psychology is just a big old integrated melting pot. For instance, right around Freud's time, there were a lot of different schools of thought about how the study of the human mind should be tackled. Mainly, there were the ideas of structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. Scientific psychology got its start in 1879 in Germany when physician Wilhelm Wundt set up the first psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig just a few years after publishing his Principles of Physiological Psychology, considered the first true psychology textbook. Wundt and his student Edward Bradford Titchener took cues from chemists and physicists and argued that if those people could break down all matter into simple elements or structures, why couldn't they do the same for the brain? They tried to understand the structures of consciousness by getting patients to look inward, asking them how they felt when they watched a sunset or smelled a coffee or licked a kitten or whatever. Titchener named this approach structuralism, but despite its rigid-sounding name, it really relied so much on introspection that it became too subjective. I mean, you may sense and feel something different than I do, even if we lick the same kitten. Psychologists, of course, can't actually observe a patient's inner thoughts or feelings, so ultimately the structuralist school of thought was fairly short-lived. By contrast, American physician and philosopher William James proposed a different set of questions, focusing on why we think and feel and smell and lick or whatever. Basically, he focused on the function of behavior. This approach, functionalism, was inspired by Charles Darwin's idea that adaptive behaviors are conserved throughout the evolutionary process. James published his seminal book, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, defining psychology as the science of mental life, just as Freud was starting to flex his big brain. Sigmund Freud began his medical career at a Viennese hospital, but in 1886, he started his own practice specializing in nervous disorders. During this time, Freud witnessed his colleague Josef Breuer treat a patient called Anna O with a new talking cure. Basically, it just let her talk about her symptoms. The more she talked and pulled up traumatic memories, the more her symptoms were reduced. It was a breakthrough, and it changed Freud forever. From then on, Freud encouraged his patients to talk freely about whatever came to mind, to free associate. This technique provided the basis for his career and an entire branch of psychology. In 1900, he published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, where he introduced his theory of psychoanalysis. Now, you probably think of psychoanalysis as a treatment, the whole patient on the couch scenario, and that's definitely part of it. But Freud's concept was actually a lot more complex than that, and it was revolutionary. The radical kernel of psychoanalysis was the theory that our personalities are shaped by unconscious motives. Basically, Freud suggested that we're all profoundly affected by mental processes that we're not even aware of. Now that sounds almost obvious to us now, but part of the genius of Freud's theory was that in 1900, it wasn't obvious at all. The idea that our minds could be driven by something that our minds themselves didn't know about was hard to grasp. As hard as, maybe organisms evolving by natural selection. It was abstract, invisible, and there was something about it that seemed irrational. But the other important part of Freud's theory was that the subconscious, literally the thing below consciousness, was still discoverable. Even though you weren't aware of it, you could come to understand it through a therapeutic technique that used dreams, projections, and free association to root out repressed feelings and gain self-insight. So what Freud was really saying was that mental disorders could be healed through talk therapy and self-discovery. And this was a really big breakthrough, because prior to this, people with mental illnesses would be confined to sanatoriums and at best given menial labor to do, and at worst, shackled to a bed frame. After the interpretation of dreams, Freud went on to publish over 20 more books and countless papers with an iconic cigar in hand all the while. He believed smoking helped him think, but it also helped him get jaw cancer. During the last 16 years of his life, he underwent at least 30 painful operations while continuing to smoke. By the late 1930s, the Nazis had taken over Austria, and Freud and his Jewish family narrowly escaped to England. By September 1939, the pain in his cancerous jaw was too great, and a doctor friend assisted him in suicide through morphine injection. He was 83. Whether you love him or hate him, and make no mistake, plenty of people vehemently disagreed with him, there is no question that Freud's impact on psychology was monumental. While competing theories in the young field of psychology either fell away or evolved into something else, psychoanalysis remains an important concept and practice today. The next big shakeup rolled in during the first half of the 20th century when behaviorism gained a higher profile. Heavy hitters like Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner were key players here. They focused on the study of observable behavior. You may remember Skinner as the dude who put rats and pigeons and babies in boxes and conditioned them to perform certain behaviors. Right around when Freud escaped to England, Skinner published his Behavior of Organisms, ushering in the era of behaviorism, which remained all the rage well into the 1960s. The other major force at the time was, of course, Freud's psychoanalysis and its many descendants, collectively known as the psychodynamic theories. These focused on the importance of early experiences in shaping the unconsciousness and how that process affects our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and personalities. By the mid-20th century, other major forces in psychology were also brewing. Schools we'll explore later in this course, including humanist psychology, which focuses on nurturing personal growth, cognitive science, and neuroscience, all of which contributed their own unique takes on the study of mind. Today's formal definition of psychology, the study of behavior and mental processes, is a nice amalgamation that pulls from all these different schools of thought. It recognizes the need for observing and recording behavior, whether that's screaming, crying, or playing air saxophone to an imaginary audience, but it also gives credit to our mental processes, what we think and feel and believe while we're tearing it up on our invisible instruments. Because again, the point that I really want you to take home is that psychology is an integrative science. Yes, folks still get grumpy and disagree plenty, but the essence of the discipline has everything to do with creating different ways of asking interesting questions and attempting to answer them through all kinds of data gathering methods. The human mind is complicated. There is no single way to effectively crack it open. It must be pried at from all sides. Harvard astronomer Owen Gingerich has gazed into the distant horizons of space, and even he has acknowledged that the human brain is by far the most complex physical object known to us in the entire cosmos. And we all get to have one of our very own, knocking around right up in here. We here at Crash Course are really excited to spend the next several months delving into the world of psychology.
Okay, so I hope you found that video useful. As you can see at the bottom, there are a variety of different videos that this particular person has made available. So you may find that you want to have a look at some of these later on as a refresher or to give you an introduction to the areas. So for example, research and experimentation, and then things such as the clinical mind. But now we're going to move on from this part. Okay, so we're now going to look at psychology as a science. And this will help feed into your second section looking at research methods as well. So what is a science? Science is about observing and questioning, experimentation. Scienter means knowledge, and then ology is the study of. So you're studying knowledge of something, and this is the scientific method. These are different ways in which you can conduct scientific research. So if you look at the left-hand side, you could start off with a research question. So what are you wanting to investigate? You then move on to hypothesis. So what are you expecting to happen? You then run the experiment. And then from the results of this experiment, you may then go and develop new questions that you want to go and investigate, which again could lead into a hypothesis. So it can be a variety of different factors and stages in scientific research, and it could lead to some insight into the particular area you're researching and testing your hypothesis, but it can also lead to the development of further research ideas and further investigation. So with the scientific method, if you start at the top, you'll start off with initial observation. You'll then gather information and form your hypothesis. You'll test this hypothesis through conducting the research, analyse your data and draw conclusions, report these findings, and then develop further research and theory building. So this relates back to the previous slide, as I say, looking at the different cogs and the way in which they interplay. And through doing any research yourself, you will be looking at gathering information for your research project and testing particular hypotheses. This is with a quantitative method. Analysing your data through statistical analysis, or if you're doing qualitative research, you'll be doing techniques such as, for example, thematic analysis. And then you will be looking at reporting your findings in a set write-up format, and then looking at further research and suggestions for further research recommendations, what the implications of your research are, and what you've found out and how it links to existing research or does not link to it. So the key terminology that I've spoken about is a hypothesis. It's a specific prediction about a phenomenon. So do you think that there is going to be a relationship between gender and intelligence, for example? It could be your theory is a set of formal statements explaining how and why events are related to one another and supporting it with empirical evidence. And your empirical evidence is data collected through direct observation or experimentation. And when looking at replication, it's repeating study methods and finding the same results. And this is why it's important when you're writing up a methodology, and particularly procedure, that you give it as a step-by-step guide as to how you went about doing something. So if you were baking a cake, you'd need to know what ingredients you are required to bake it and the order in which you go and produce the cake. So how you're going to follow out the recipe. It needs to be that so someone else can go and do it and develop exactly the same output. So in this case, producing the same cake. Okay, so moving on to physical sciences. This could be things such as biology, chemistry and physics. You're looking at laws of nature, and this is considered to be fundamental sciences. So as I say, you could be looking at biological factors, looking at mathematics, looking at chemistry, looking at physics. Life sciences are looking at living things, so it could be looking at medicine, it could be looking at a person's health and investigating agriculture. And then your social sciences. So it could be looking at humans and human behaviour, and this is more often than not where psychology falls under. So I'm going to show you a useful video clip now about whether psychology is considered a science. And I would argue, and is emphasised in this video, that psychology is a science.
Hello and welcome to SciShow Psych. I am Hank Green, one of your hosts, and twice a week we will be here exploring the science of what makes humans tick. That's right, I said it, psychology is a science. People have been debating this pretty much since psychology started back in the 1800s. You can sort of see why people might think psychology doesn't count as a science. The study of the human mind is often missing the tightly controlled experimental conditions and conclusive results that you'll find in other fields like astronomy or chemistry. And yeah, psychology research can be tricky because brains are complicated, but it's still a science. Now, defining science is surprisingly hard because there's no standard definition everyone agrees on. But most people would probably agree with this. Science is systematically observing natural events, then using those observations to develop laws and principles. Then those principles are tested through the scientific method, that list of steps you probably learned in your first science class: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis, and conclusion. Still, these are really just basic guidelines, and most branches of science will operate a little differently from one another. Like particle physicists can't directly observe the Higgs boson. Instead, they rely on statistics to know it's there. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that physics isn't actually science. The so-called rules of science all depend on the type of work a scientist is doing, and psychology is no exception. Psychology is the study of the human mind and behavior, and there are lots of different ways to do that. But any good psychologist can demonstrate that their research follows the scientific method just like biology biology or chemistry. After observing patterns in human behavior, psychologists usually develop a specific testable hypothesis about why that behavior happens, or they might create a scenario and see if it leads to certain behaviors. Then, if they want to find correlation between variables, that a certain event and behavior are related, they'll conduct a field experiment where they carefully observe subjects in normal, uncontrolled circumstances. Or if they want to determine causation, whether or not a certain event actually triggers a behavior, they'll create a rigorous, highly controlled, and replicable laboratory experiment. Next, they'll use statistics to analyze relationships within those data, and to make sure the findings are reliable, the experiments are often repeated under the same conditions. Sounds a lot like science, right? People who don't believe psychology is a science will usually say that psychology isn't rigorous enough, that data are often inconclusive or can be interpreted in too many ways. They might also argue that the definitions in psychology are too abstract to be accurately tested. For example, how do you define happiness? People define it differently depending on their culture, their circumstances, or even what day it is, so how can researchers objectively define it? Also, how can you objectively measure or quantify something as abstract as happiness? Another argument is that the results in psychology can't be reliably reproduced because people change every day. But psychologists account for those things. Like, even though you can't directly measure abstract concepts like happiness or anger, psychologists operationalize them, meaning they create, validate, and test a functional definition that serves as a good substitute for something abstract. Going back to our happiness example, they might study it by tracking how often a person smiles or laughs. Or they could have people rate their happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, or track the amount of endorphins in their system. All of these are useful for different reasons and offer valid, valuable data. Also, a lot of arguments against psychology miss the whole point of the field. Psychology isn't looking to capture a universal human experience, because that doesn't exist. Humans are messy. You're influenced by so many things, from your culture to your circumstances, and even that book you read all the time back as a kid. Creating broad, strict rules for human behavior would miss a lot of the nuance and detail found in different people and situations. So as long as researchers acknowledge that their work is limited by the differences between people and take that into account in their analyses and conclusions, it's not an issue. At the end of the day, psychology is a science, just like biology or chemistry or particle physics. But there is plenty of pseudoscience out there, self-help books and advice columns and websites that make claims about psychology that are totally false, and it can be hard to separate fact from fiction. And that is part of why we're starting this show. Humans are strange and fascinating and surprising, and we want to explore the science behind how we think and behave, but we'll also be debunking some misconceptions along the way, and we will do that using hard scientific evidence. We hope you'll join us. Thank you for watching this video.
Okay, so I hope you found that useful and looking at the arguments for psychology being a scientific discipline. Likewise with the other video, there may be some other ones on YouTube that you find helpful, but we'll move on for now. Okay, so to end this lecture, we'll move on to the directive activities and complete the lecture 1 quiz, and then I'll join you back in lecture 2 afterwards. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at h.mcewen@wus.ac.uk.